Welcome to Opening the Gate to Awakening. Opening the Gate to Awakening is organized by Mid-America Buddhist Association in Augusta, Missouri. MABA is a Chan monastery and has organized the Opening to the Gate of Awakening in order to bring Buddhist teachings from various lineages and good teachers to as many people as we can. I am Sian Singh Sherry. I'm one of the lay teachers at MABA. And it's my honor tonight to welcome Venerable Karme Lekshe Somo as our speaker this evening. The Venerable is a Buddhist monastic, scholar, and social activist. She took novice ordination with the 16th Karmapa in 1977, full ordination in Korea in 1982. She spent 15 years studying at the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics in Dharamsala, India. She has a PhD in comparative philosophy from the University of Hawaii, and she is a professor of theology and religious studies at the University of San Diego. She's the author of numerous works on women in Buddhist traditions, social justice, and the Bhikkhuni Pratimoksha. She's also actively engaged in social activities. She is a co-founder of Sakyadhita, the international organization that supports and works for gender equality in Buddhism. And she is a founder of the Jamyang Foundation, which supports education for female monastics and girls who have few other opportunities for education. The foundation has started schools in several countries, including India, Bangladesh, and Laos. There's a link for the Jamyang Foundation in the chat box to which you can make offerings in your gratitude for the Venerable's teaching and to help out the work of the foundation. Venerable will give a talk followed by a question and answer session. If you'll please type your questions into the chat box, the Venerable will answer them after her talk. So welcome, Venerable. We are delighted to hear you speak this evening.
Thank you so much. Namaste, aloha, and tashi dele. I'm very happy to be with you here this evening and to discuss a really important topic. I understand that you're discussing the overall theme of opening the gates of awakening. So let's see how that applies to women, awakening the gates of opening the gates of awakening to women as well as men and other gendered identities. So I have a PowerPoint slideshow, and I will show you some slides so we can get to know Buddhist women around the world. In a sense, we can say that Buddhism got started off on a really good footing. In fact, the Buddha made a very clear statement about the equal potential of Buddhist women, of women in general, to achieve liberation. In fact, I think maybe the Buddha's statement in support of women may be one of the clearest articulations of support for women in any religious tradition. So that's really something wonderful, a very clear, positive statement that, yes, women can also become liberated. Somehow along the way, though, after the Buddha's passing, it seems that this was challenged, or maybe we should say it was challenging to some people. And in fact, that would be those who were mostly in power. But let's take some images, and I'll speak from the slides, and we'll try to explore this question in more detail. Exactly what is women's role in Buddhism? What is women's potential? Are men and women really equal in Buddhism? If so, how? If not, why not? So please join me for this exploration. I'll share the screen here. Let's see. Okay. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. And let me see if I can move this up a bit so we can get, let's see, maybe I have to move this down. How can I open the slideshow? Oh, from the beginning, here we go. Okay, great. Now we can see the slides on the full screen. Okay, so taking it from the top, let's begin with Mother Maya. Mother Maya was the one who gave birth to the young prince, Prince Siddhartha. And I guess we could say that without Mother Maya, there would have been no Prince Siddhartha, so there would have been no Buddha, and then there would be no Buddhism. So we're immensely grateful to her and respect the role that she played in giving birth to a future Buddha. You can see her here under a sal tree near Lumbini on the way to her parents' home where she gave birth to the young prince, but not in the ordinary way. It's very interesting that she's protected from any taint, or that is, the Buddha is protected from any taint. She gives birth not to the normal channels, but from her right side. So the baby Buddha, the future Buddha, right, Prince Siddhartha, slides out on a white cloth from her right side. And of course, this was a moment of great joy. Everyone was so happy. The humans and gods rejoiced at this great event. So over the years, the Buddha grew up in the palace, and he sensed some dissatisfaction in the palace. In fact, he was married to the most beautiful woman in the land. It's said that he also had a harem of girlfriends, about 40,000 girlfriends. Whoops. Well, okay. I guess in those days, princes could do as they liked. But this probably is given to show he was, he didn't become a renunciant because he was not effective as a layperson. In fact, he mastered that and then gave it up. So that makes his renunciation more powerful. This is just speculation, but given the way the story of the renunciation is told, it kind of fits in. So after leaving the palace, sneaking out the first time and seeing the four sights, and then deciding he really would leave his young bride, Yashodhara, and the young son, a newborn son, Rahula, he set off to seek the meaning of life. Now, this story is also quite disputed. It's controversial because, in general, what does society think of a man who abandons his wife and newborn son, a newborn child, in the middle of the night, for that matter, without awakening them to say goodbye and so forth? Normally, that's not something that would be applauded for an ordinary person. Somehow, though, in the Buddhist world, in the Buddhist story, this is something that is applauded, that is thought to be a really great move on his part, that he gave up the palace life. In fact, it's called the Great Renunciation. If he had nothing, it wouldn't have been so great. But since he had, 3 palaces and all these, this huge harem and this beautiful wife and this young child, then to give all that up is symbolically something very significant. So this is how the story is generally read in Buddhist societies. So we're looking at the question from both sides here. Now, after he left the palace and went off to seek the meaning of life, an end to suffering, he practiced in the forest for 6 years, lots of austerities, extreme austerities. You can see that he fasted until he was hardly able to meditate. He was so weak. And just at that point, another figure appears, which is Sujata, who offers him a bowl of rice pudding, or kheer as they call it. And he decided to accept her offering, and he regained his strength and then went off to cross the river, find a nice Bodhi tree to sit underneath, a peepal tree, and sit with making the determination not to arise until he had reached the final goal. Now, there are so many significant female figures in his life. The other one, which maybe should have come first, except she doesn't become a nun until later. So this is his stepmother, Mahapajapati, who is also his auntie. So it seems that his father was married to both sisters. So after his mother passed away, and when he was only 7 days old, he was raised by his stepmother, an auntie. She was extremely kind to him, and he had a wonderful, loving home. This story is also a bit controversial. Mother Maya disappears from the scene after only 7 days. And some have questioned this. Why does she disappear? If she's so significant, if she's so virtuous, so pure that it's she who is designated to give birth to this world-renowned figure, then why does she die? Well, that's is her only task to give birth to a child? Isn't there something more to the story? But that's all we know. We don't know that much about her because she's not mentioned much after that. We have more information about his stepmother because from the time he was 7 days old, she took charge of his upbringing. She nursed him, she raised him, she taught him to walk and talk. And she must have done a very good job because he was a very special child. And it seems that he got an excellent education and excellent training. Now, later on, she becomes the first Buddhist nun. As the story goes, after the Buddha's awakening, he walked up and down in meditation for 49 days and then made his way over to Sarnath, the deer park, where he gave his first teaching. And traditionally, it's thought that he taught the Four Noble Truths. Now there's some discussion about that. Was that really his first teaching? In any case, that's the way the story goes, that he taught the Four Noble Truths over in the deer park. And his former 5 companions, who had also been seeking the meaning of life, but who had abandoned him when he took the rice pudding from Sujata, caught sight of him, and they at first thought they would shun him, but then they realized something very special had happened, that he had clearly achieved some kind of understanding, and they wanted to know what it was. So they approached him and they bowed, and they wanted to become his followers. And so, as the story goes, he said, "Come here." And they were instantly transformed into monks with shaved heads and robes. And this was the beginning of the Bhikkhu Sangha. After that, hundreds and thousands of young men. In the beginning, they were mostly aristocrats. Later on, people from all different class backgrounds joined the Sangha. But all men, right? The first 5-6 years were only male followers. And then Mahapajapati asked the Buddha to also allow her to join the Sangha. And here comes another controversial story. It is said that the Buddha hesitated 3 times. As I read this story, I don't think that he outright refused her. It sounds like he was saying, "Oh, please don't ask. Please don't ask. Please don't ask." You could say in Asian societies, maybe that's a no, but on the other hand, it kind of left the door open. And she challenged it. She got her friends, the ladies at court together, and they decided to shave their heads and put on robes and go to ask him again. By that time, he was teaching over in Vaishali, and that was hundreds of miles away. And here were these aristocratic women, barefooted, trekking through the mud and the sun and the dust and all the elements, determined to join the Sangha, to become nuns and to seek liberation. So finally they arrived, all disheveled and windblown and dirty and very exhausted. And again, they asked the Buddha to be admitted to the Sangha. Again, he hesitated. But finally, Ananda, friend of women, became their advocate. And he asked the Buddha, you know, Mahapajapati was so kind when you were a baby. She suckled you, she raised you, she treated you with such loving kindness. And the Buddha said, yes, it's true. And then Ananda said, well, wouldn't it be well then if she were allowed to join the Sangha? And the Buddha said, okay. He allowed her to join the Sangha. Now, this story is also fraught with controversy because it said that she was required to accept 8 special rules, 8 weighty rules, as the price of her admission to the Sangha. Now, recently, scholars have made it pretty clear that these 8 rules were not spoken by the Buddha at all, but were actually added later, probably almost certainly after the Buddha's passing. These 8 rules actually subordinate the nuns to the monks. For example, the first one is that a nun, even of 100 years standing, when she encounters a monk ordained even that very day, should rise and pay respect to him. Another rule is that whereas monks can be ordained by 10 monks, 10 bhikkhus, a nun must be fully ordained by 10 bhikkhus and 10 bhikkhunis. This would make it approximately twice as hard for nuns to get ordained, to assemble that many ordination masters. Another rule says that in order to be absolved of a transgression, whereas the bhikkhus can be absolved by a congregation of 20 bhikkhus, for a nun, it requires 20 bhikkhus and 20 bhikkhunis, again, making the process about twice as difficult for nuns. There's one rule that says that nuns should not do the rainy season retreat in a place where there is no monk. Now that one makes sense, I think, in that the monk might be seen as a kind of protection for the nuns. But then another one of the 8 weighty rules says that whereas monks can scold nuns, nuns cannot scold monks. Well, okay. And whether they were spoken by the Buddha or not, in fact, it seems that they certainly were not, it's almost as if we're stuck with them because they've become part of tradition. They're actually found in the Buddhist canon. And so it's difficult to dispute them in a way. We pretty much are obliged to at least pay lip service to these rules. And opinion differs. There are those who think that it's really a nun's duty to abide by them strictly, and others who say, well, you know, yeah, sure, well, that's fine, you know, but they don't go too much out of their way to bow to junior monks and so forth. Now, the problem here is that within the 8 weighty rules, there are many contradictions. For example, it said that the Buddha required Mahapajapati to be ordained by a sangha, a dual sangha of 10 bhikkhus and 10 bhikkhunis. But how could that be? There were no other bhikkhunis. She was the only one. She was the first one. Right? And then it says that a nun who makes a transgression needs to be absolved by a congregation of both 20 bhikkhus and 20 bhikkhunis. But how could that be? There were no other bhikkhunis at that time. So from a logical point of view, it doesn't really make sense. In any case, I'm raising all these sticky points just for the sake of just out of interest. We can try to understand the situation better. What we know is that the Buddha did teach all audiences, men and women both, people of all ages, children, old folks. He taught people of all different class backgrounds and different educational backgrounds, different caste backgrounds, and that's very significant too. And in fact, it was quite revolutionary because caste was already very much entrenched. And the Buddha said that a noble being is one who is most noble at heart, not the one who belongs to the higher castes, right? An Aryan being, Aryan, noble. And we see how that term has been misappropriated later on. So, and this picture is quite sweet because we can see that they're wearing the robes of the Burmese bhikkhunis. In fact, I took it at a Burmese monastery in Penang, Malaysia. But it shows that women were among the listeners to the early Buddhist teachings. Now here is a painting from a wall, a mural in southern Laos, and it depicts the four quarters of the ideal Buddhist society. A strong, stable Buddhist society has four pillars, the Buddha said: the lay men, the lay women, the bhikkhus, and the bhikkhunis. So you'll see in this image, this painting, the lay men, the lay women, the bhikkhus, a bhikkhuni, and then a white-robed nun. Now, this is significant in that the white-robed nuns are those who are practicing in Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia today. They don't have access to full ordination because the lineage of full ordination was never established, as far as we know, in these countries. It may have been established in Burma way back, but today there is no bhikkhuni sangha in Southeast Asia. And therefore, the full ordination of nuns is not possible. But I find this mural quite significant in that, well, even though the nuns didn't get their hands on the Dharma wheel to uplift it, at least they got in the picture. I think that's really, really lovely. Now, the next historical figure that we meet in the Buddhist historical timeline is named Sanghmitra, literally friend of the Sangha. She was the daughter of Emperor Ashoka, who lived in India a couple of hundred years after the Buddha. Emperor Ashoka, you may remember the story, was a fierce warrior. He conquered all of North India and he laid waste to many lands. One morning he woke up and he saw the carnage around him, hundreds of people who had been slaughtered. And he realized suddenly that he'd done something really terrible. He felt tremendous remorse. And they say at that point, due to regret for his past very unwholesome actions, he became a Buddhist and he turned his life around. He became a strong supporter of the Buddhist Sangha. He engaged in many social welfare deeds, such as constructing wells and roads and bridges and so forth. His son Mahinda became a monk, a Buddhist monk, a bhikkhu, and went down to Sri Lanka to teach. In Sri Lanka, he gave ordination to hundreds of young men who became bhikkhus. And then the Queen Anula, came and asked if she could join too. Mahinda said, that's a very fine aspiration, but I cannot do that because I'm not a nun. But my sister is a nun. We could invite her to give an ordination. And they did. So they invited her from northern India, and she sailed by ship along the east coast of India all the way to Sri Lanka. And with her, she brought a sapling of the Bodhi tree under which the Buddha is said to have sat when he reached perfect awakening. She must have been very courageous to make such a treacherous journey. But hundreds of other women as bhikkhunis. And they took the Bodhi tree and planted it. And they say that the one that is in Anuradhapura today is a direct descendant of that Bodhi tree. So she's very famous for this. In fact, Sanghamitra, as far as I know, is the only woman who has a national holiday named after her in the world. In Sri Lanka, Sanghamitra is a national holiday. So, Buddhist trivia. National holiday named after, and it's the first holiday named after, after a woman, as far as we know. So, one said that she hid the tooth of the Buddha in her hair in India, and she brought it to Sri Lanka surreptitiously. So, well, in a way, it would be taking what is not given. On the other hand, the Sri Lankans are really happy that she did because they consider it a great blessing. And this is the tooth that is said to be enshrined at the temple in Kandy in Sri Lanka even today. So her name was Hema. Okay, now not only real life historical women, but we also have many images of awakening in female form. This is Tara, for example. There are many stories about Tara, but the most famous one is that she was a very precocious young woman who was excellent in studies and in practice. And her male colleagues, her guy friends, all said, "Oh, it looks like you're about to become awakened. It's time that you take a male body." And she said, "I don't think so." She said, "Many people have reached awakening in a male body, but very few have reached awakening in a female body. I'll do that. I will reach full awakening in a female body." And she did. She's said to have 21 forms with different gestures, different colors, different ornaments, and so forth. And eventually she did become fully awakened. So that's why we sometimes hear her referred to as a bodhisattva, and at other times we find her referred to as a Buddha named Tara. And this is not just a Tibetan thing, it's also found in India, the texts of Tara. So, and the practices of Tara. We also have Prajnaparamita, who is imaged as the mother of all Buddhas. We have Saraswati, who is the bodhisattva renowned for her learning and patronage of the arts. We have Kuan Yin, who is Avalokiteshvara, but in India, Avalokiteshvara is male. Avalokiteshvara was male also in China up to about the 12th century, when somehow she made the sex change and became imaged in a female body. Now, there's a book about 700 pages long that tells the history of this. When she lost the mustache, when Avalokiteshvara lost the mustache and started to take this androgynous form, and eventually in China, a female form. Many reasons have been sort of posited, all speculation, but some feel it was because Buddhism was so male, like male teachers all the way down. And so they needed some balance in China. Another opinion is that perhaps it's because women are always associated with compassion, and therefore they felt that Avalokiteshvara, now Kuan Yin, should be shown in female form. Others have sort of speculated that perhaps it was because in China there are many, many female goddesses, and they were quite used to seeing goddesses in female form. And so for them, it was not a stretch to see a bodhisattva in female form. We don't know for certain, or we may never know, but it's kind of fun to speculate. In any case, Kuan Yin, as you know, is so popular. She's everywhere. She's in almost, so many Chinese homes, almost all Chinese restaurants, and she's highly revered. There are sightings of her. Even today in China, people have visions of her. What's curious is how closely her form resembles the Virgin Mary. And we used to think this was unusual. What's going on here? But then now we know that there was a lot of interaction along the Silk Road, not only the Silk Road, also the Maritime route, but across from Rome to Western China, it's not that far to travel. People did it. It was a treacherous journey, but and a bit dangerous, but people made it, and there was a lot of exchange going on, maybe more on the southern route through Afghanistan. But in any case, they may have borrowed some of these artistic forms, like the way the robes flow and so forth, because in China, we even find her eventually holding a baby, like a Madonna figure, which is curious, but also, the loving kindness of women and all that. So we have some wrathful forms of different Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in the Tantric tradition, such as Vajravarahi, Dorjipomo. And so these female Buddhas and Bodhisattvas can take either peaceful or wrathful forms. Wrathful forms in order to overcome our strong delusions. Okay? Now, what about real live women on the ground today? Well, here we see Burmese nuns wearing a sort of pink robe, but you'll see that there is an orange underskirt and also an ochre shawl. So rather than adopting the white robes of an 8-precept nun, they found a middle way. Neither fully ochre robes, which is not allowed in Burma. Women are not allowed to wear the ochre robes, but also not the white robes, white being the color of lay people traditionally in Asia, in Buddhist countries. The nuns of Burma are supported often by their own villagers and families. They're not allowed to collect cooked food, alms in the form of a cooked lunch, but they're allowed to go for alms and receive uncooked rice. So they'll take a tray on their heads and they'll go to the villages. And people are quite generous. Enough that they can live. They live simply, and they don't eat after noon. They keep the precepts of a bhikkhuni, even though they're not acknowledged as bhikkhunis. There is no bhikkhuni lineage, but they live like bhikkhunis and they practice like bhikkhunis. In Burma, not just the nuns, but meditation today is very popular in Burma and all over Southeast Asia and South Asia. And the 10-day Vipassana courses are widespread. It's possible to get leave from the office to become a nun for a month and to do a 1-month Vipassana retreat. So when you walk around Rangoon today, Yangon, you'll see young women with short hair showing that they've probably just been to the monastery and done a 1-month retreat during their vacation. Instead of going to the Riviera or something, they go for meditation. So, and nuns in Burma also have the opportunity to study Pali and Abhidharma up to the 9th level, and many of them in the national exams. So they're really going for it, and many are becoming teachers, and then nuns are becoming highly respected. We see a big change in the last 30 years. So even little girls are becoming nuns. And I don't know how to explain it, how a child of like 6 or 7 years old, just, some of my students up in the Himalayas also, they come at such a young age and they're absolutely determined. It's enough to make you believe in rebirth. They really want to be nuns at such a tender age. So they're off to a flying start, right? So now in China also, there are said to be many tens of thousands of nuns, and they do have full ordination. So there are certain countries where women can become fully ordained. That would be China, Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and throughout the Chinese Buddhist diaspora, Malaysia, Singapore, Los Angeles, and other countries. And some people estimate that there are probably 100,000 fully ordained nuns in China, but we don't have an exact count. Yeah, we don't have access to those records. And this is despite the fact that they're not getting a whole lot of encouragement from the government in China today. So now here is an example of a monastery in Thailand, which has become something of a trendsetter in going for full ordination for nuns in a country that has traditionally had no bhikkhuni lineage. That's Thailand. So in Thailand, normally the women would take 8 precepts, occasionally 9 or 10 like in Burma, but usually 8. And they would wear white. And again, they would need support from some quarter, often from their families. Otherwise, they would live in the corner of a monk's temple and help with the cooking and cleaning and eat the leftovers from the monks. Now, that was not an ideal situation, and lots of changes have happened in the last 30 years. So, for example, a nun named Dhammananda is the main trendsetter, some say troublemaker, and she went to Sri Lanka and became fully ordained as a bhikkhuni. I say that in jest. She would have a good chuckle with it. She went to Sri Lanka and became fully ordained and came back and started training nuns as novices, seminary, and gradually and training them in meditation as well as in Vinaya and in Dharma. And her community, which is about an hour outside of Bangkok, has really flourished. Her mother had been a bhikkhuni, but she had gotten her precepts in Taiwan. And when she came back from Taiwan, her ordination was not recognized by the Thai Sangha. As a consequence, her daughter, Dhammananda, she had been a layperson before she became a nun. Her daughter, Dhammananda Chatsuman Kabal Singh, a university professor, decided to become ordained within the Theravada tradition. So she went to Sri Lanka, where there were already some nuns who had become bhikkhunis, mostly ordained from Taiwan, or ordained by nuns from Taiwan in India. Or sometimes ordained in other places, but most likely in India. And now these nuns have begun to receive bhikkhuni precepts, going to Sri Lanka themselves after training as a novice seminary for 2 years. Then they'll go down to Sri Lanka and receive full ordination there. A few years ago, she invited a Sri Lankan bhikkhu to come to Thailand to give the ordination in Thailand itself, down in southern Thailand. A number of nuns were ordained in that ordination, but the Thai Bhikkhu Sangha was not pleased. And they passed a law within the monastic body that henceforth no foreign monk is allowed to give ordination to nuns in Thailand. Now, of course, if no foreign monk were allowed to give ordination in Thailand, there might be no bhikkhus in Thailand today, because during the history of Thailand, the ordination has often been given by foreign monks. In any case, the nuns in Thailand are doing very well. They're studying, they're practicing, they're keeping the precepts very carefully. They're highly respected by the lay community, which is very important to get the support of the lay community. And the ordination of nuns, of course, sends a strong message to lay society that, you know, women can be excellent practitioners. Women can observe the precepts purely. Women can be role models for the community. Women can become teachers of Dharma, teachers of meditation, and so on. So these ordinations are very significant. Now, this is southern Laos, and there are no bhikkhunis in Laos. The nuns take 8 precepts, and these nuns have been through a lot. You know, Laos was said to be the most heavily bombed country in world history. A couple of million people died. It was just strafe bombing of civilians. It was really horrible during the Vietnam War time. These nuns had all lost their whole families, and you can see that they're not terribly well supported, but they get enough, just enough to live. And they feel very fortunate to have the opportunity to be nuns and to work full-time at Dharma practice. And so they're very grateful, actually, for the opportunity. They appreciate being nuns and working for liberation. Now, this is Nepal, and the figure in the center is Venerable Dhammawati. She's a very highly respected teacher in Nepal. When she was a child, 13 years old, she ran away from home to become a nun. And she followed a monk over to Burma and got arrested on the Burmese border because she didn't have a passport. But after some time, the border patrol, the authorities could see her sincerity, and they placed her with a Burmese family, and she became a nun. She was able to learn Burmese. She studied up to Abhidharma. She became a Dhammachara, the highest title that was available at that time in studies. And then after 13 years in Burma, she returned to Nepal and was a major figure in the restoration of Theravada Buddhism in the Kathmandu Valley. She has thousands, tens of thousands of disciples around Nepal, especially central Nepal, including more than 400 nuns. Now, she went to Los Angeles to become ordained as a bhikkhuni at Shifang Temple in 1988. And since then, she has sent her students to China and to in different places to receive full ordination also. So these nuns are doing wonderful work, educating young people in Dharma. And the one who's in maroon robes is Chiring Doma, the one who has made so many beautiful albums of Dharma music in Nepal. So now here's Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has been the success story a real success story in Buddhist women's history, because before there had been no bhikkhunis since about the 11th century. Both in India and in Sri Lanka, the bhikkhuni sangha, the lineage died out about the 11th century, probably due to famine. When there's no food to eat, who's going to become a monk or nun, right? Fortunately for us, before the lineage died out in around the 5th century, 429 to be exact, CE, the Common Era, some Sri Lankan nuns went to China, and there they ordained hundreds of Chinese women as nuns. And that's the lineage of Bhikkhuni ordination that has survived until today. In China, despite the difficulties, in Korea, in Taiwan, and Vietnam. Unfortunately, not in Japan. But so thankfully, then we have the lineage today, preserved until today. And the Sri Lankan nuns thought, well, we can take it back. We gave the lineage to Chinese nuns. Now we can take it back from the Chinese nuns. And they did. In 1987, when we had our first Sakya conference, it was the first international gathering of Buddhist women in Bodh Gaya. A delegation of 16 came from Sri Lanka, including the Minister of Buddhist Affairs. And before that, they had not even heard the word Bhikkhuni. But the minute they heard it, they thought, oh, we must have this lineage. So they worked to resuscitate or revive the Bhikkhuni lineage in Sri Lanka. Today, probably at least more than 2,000 nuns, at least half of the nuns in Sri Lanka have become fully ordained. And every year, more and more become fully ordained. So it's a personal choice, but many have made that choice to become a bhikkhuni. Now, here's an example of an ordination in China, of course, from 1950 or 1949 until 1982, Buddhism was suppressed in China. But since 1982, there has been a revival of Buddhism in China, and they've managed to revive both the Bhikkhu and Bhikkhuni Sangha, and many temples have been rebuilt, and ordinations have began to be held again in China since 1982. Some very large ones. In Korea, there is an ordination every year, an annual ordination. This was my own ordination in 1982. And I must have been taking the picture because I don't think I'm in the picture. But this was a special event because both bhikkhus and bhikkhunis gave the ordination in the sort of fashion, the format that is described in the text. So that was quite significant, and I was fortunate to be there. This is Vietnam. This is when we had our Sakya conference in Vietnam, and 2010. And it said that there are more than 20,000 bhikkhunis in Vietnam. Vietnam also had a difficult time from 1976 to 1982, but Buddhism has revived and it's alive and well. And the bhikkhunis are very, very vibrant communities all over Vietnam, doing wonderful work in all directions, meditation, studies, and social engagement. In the Tibetan tradition, the condition of nuns was quite sad until about 30 years ago when we created some education programs after the Sakya conference. I think that the women became very much encouraged to study, and they have been doing very well ever since. They are doing, all the ceremonies that the monks are doing. They're wearing the yellow robe. They're attending international conferences. They're getting an education from a young age in many monasteries throughout the Himalayas. Now, I'm not talking about Tibet. I'm talking about the Indian Himalayas, where Jamyang Foundation has been working. We've helped to create 15 monasteries, and in Tibet itself, there are also some very encouraging signs. Large communities, one with 8,000 nuns and another one with something like 10,000 nuns. But unfortunately, these communities often get destroyed by the government and they have to start again from scratch. So it's not easy in Tibet itself. Outside of Tibet, in India, even though the land is very poor, at least people have the freedom to practice the Dharma. So, and the young ones are very adorable and they like to study, they love to meditate, and they're very cute. Now, big breakthrough here was that in 2017, December, the first batch of 20 nuns received the Geshe degree, sometimes called Geshe Ma, which would be a feminine ending. So 20 nuns, after 30 years of study, took their exams and emerged successful as the first female Geshes in history, including 6 of my students. So I'm very, very proud of them. They worked very, very hard. And now every year, they're happy campers. Some now are going on to be teachers and translators and going into retreat and doing summer learning science. They're doing marvelous work. And every year now, every successive batches of nuns are taking the Geshe degree. So more and more women are coming out as top-notch scholars of philosophy in the Tibetan tradition. Now, the remaining thing yet to be done is the full ordination of women. In the Tibetan tradition, they do not have fully ordained bhikkhunis. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama asked us to convene a conference of Vinaya scholars from around the world to discuss the matter. Vinaya meaning the monastic codes. So he wanted to know what the different traditions thought about the ordination of women. And we did as he requested, and we sat for several days to discuss what were the possibilities. How could we bring the bhikkhuni ordination into the Tibetan tradition? And we presented our findings to His Holiness, and we fully expected that he would announce, okay, on such and such a date, we will now hold a bhikkhuni ordination. To our disappointment, he did not say that. In fact, he knew that we were very disappointed. What do we say to the press? Because everyone was expecting a positive outcome, and it didn't happen. So the next day he called us and he explained that, he would really love to see bhikshunis in the Tibetan tradition. But unfortunately, he said, there's quite a lot of opposition among the senior ranking bhikkhus. And as a single monk himself, he cannot give the ordination alone. Now, fortunately, this was the group the next morning after he called us together to explain that, which was, I must frankly say, quite disappointing. But fortunately now, in recent, just in the last few weeks, an ordination was held in Bhutan. Now, this is the future generation. And they don't understand the hardships of the earlier generations, just like, young people today, young women today don't understand the hardships that some of us in the feminist movement in the 60s went through. Now, many advantages for women, still many obstacles, but lots of advantages also. Similarly, the young nuns, they don't remember when nuns didn't know how to read and write. And I think it's great that they're just going for it. And no obstacles. They all speak 4 languages. Can you imagine? They're so young, but they all speak Tibet, their own language, which is a kind of Himalayan language related to Tibetan. They speak Tibetan, proper Tibetan, they speak Hindi, and they speak English. So it's amazing when you start learning young. Well, this is Jamyang Foundation. We've been working since 1987 and continuing on today, still supporting. Some of the monasteries have become independent, self-sufficient, which was our goal. And we're still supporting 12 monasteries in India, as well as we started 4 schools in Bangladesh for little girls in the Chittagong Hill tracts along the Burmese border. And Sakadita is still going strong. We'll have our 18th conference every 2 years. We have a conference. So the next one will be in Korea. So we hope you all join us for that. It's an amazing experience to get together, and everyone is welcome, of all Buddhist traditions, men, women, lay, and non-binary. Everybody is welcome, and of all traditions and all religious traditions also. Okay, and then this is our branch in Hawaii, Sakadita Hawaii, which is where I live. And we're also doing sustainable agriculture and different programs for the community there. So that's my show. So I'd like to give you an opportunity for questions, and please feel free to challenge me or raise any sort of controversial issues. I'm very happy to dialogue with you.
Please type any questions into the chat box and Venerable will answer them. While we wait for some questions, I'd like to remind you, you can donate to Jamyang at the web link we've posted in the chat box. And I also ask you as a layperson, please remember to also donate to the Katina offering for the monks at MABA, which we will be giving them this Sunday. Surely we have some questions. Lee asks if you will please repeat the traditions that do allow ordination of women.
Okay, sure. Going from Sri Lanka to China in the 5th century, then we have a lineage, it's a Dhammagupta branch of the Vinaya. In China itself, which was passed then to Korea, to Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, Hong Kong, and then around the world, wherever there are Chinese Buddhists, there are also bhikkhunis, usually often in charge of the monasteries. In Los Angeles, in New York, in Paris, you'll find bhikkhunis around the world working selflessly night and day. And so this is the only remaining live lineage. But what they've done is to bring it into their own lineages. Because in Sri Lanka, they did not want to become a branch of Chinese Buddhism. They have their own traditions. And so they received the lineage from the Taiwanese bhikkhunis, but then they also brought in the Sri Lankan monks, and they consider themselves fully Theravada. And it looks like this is the tradition that we will follow also in the Tibetan tradition. With China, bhikkhunis from Taiwan for the first round of ordinations, holding the ordination, conferring the ordination along with bhikkhus, and then bringing the lineage completely into the Tibetan tradition. So this is what happened a few weeks ago in Bhutan. You can see on the Sakadita website, which is sakadita.org, that there was an ordination held in Bhutan itself. And this is really historical. On the website, you'll see a story by an English nun who was ordained in that ordination, her impressions, her reflections. So 144 nuns, mostly Bhutanese, but also some who came from other countries, were ordained by the head abbot of Bhutan. So as you may know, in Bhutan, they follow a tradition similar to the Tibetan tradition. Originally, they received Buddhism from the Tibetan tradition, but they've developed their own distinctive forms, their own distinctive traditions. And there are many monasteries in Bhutan and also many nuns, but until recently, they did not have ordination. Then they started receiving novice ordinations from the Tibetan tradition, and now they're the first ones in the Tibetan tradition to become fully ordained. So now we're hoping that others in the Tibetan tradition will be able to become fully ordained, and it seems like it will happen. There's one Lama who is willing to take the leadership on that, and so this is wonderful, opening the doors to awakening.
Well, that's very good news.
Yes, extremely
We
good news.
ask that everyone turn on their camera. Venerable Kongshi would like to see all your faces. And we have another question. Is there a reason China is more open to ordaining women?
Well, I think one reason is that they have had a lineage of forward nations since the 5th century. So they're quite accustomed to having bhikkhunis. They're quite accustomed to seeing women in positions of leadership in nuns' monasteries. So that's a significant factor. They're not just tangential. They're not living in the corner of a monk's monastery, cooking and cleaning for the monks. They have their own monasteries. And even though they don't get nearly the support that the monks do, but they work very hard, and they've managed to build monasteries throughout China. There have been many persecutions of Buddhism, 3 major persecutions of Buddhism, but the current persecution under the Beijing government is the most serious to date. It's been more than 70 years. And yet, Buddhism has survived and the Bhikkhuni lineage has survived. So that's really significant. It shows the determination, the persistence of the nuns. And it may also have to do with the support that Buddhists in general get in China, in Chinese, not just China itself, but in Chinese communities. The lay people are very generous in supporting the Sangha. And so the Sangha thrives wherever there are Chinese communities, Buddhist temples thrive. And the nuns are supported as well as monks. So this is very important. For a strong Sangha to grow up. They need the support of the lay community. And then the symbiotic relationship where the monastics provide teachings and role models. They lead retreats, they provide counseling, they help with the Buddhist education of children and so forth. That will continue, and also as keepers of the tradition. Then lay people for their side also practice, they also meditate, they also study, but they also provide food, clothing, and shelter for the monastics. So they have a really good working relationship. And I would say that's the best way to explain it. Yeah, they do respect and support the women. Sometimes men in China will even bow to bhikkhunis, and you don't see that in very many countries. So, yeah.
Danny asks, with genderqueer identities re-entering mainstream society, how do you see them being incorporated into the monastic orders?
Okay, well, according to tradition, the Buddhist monastic orders are quite heteronormative. By that I mean that they're divided into male and female, bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. There has not traditionally been a middle way, or shall we say, a path for people who are in between or of some other gender identity. Today, I think people are rethinking this. And personally, I would say, however a person identifies, then they should be welcomed in the community of their choice. But that's just my personal opinion, and I cannot speak for all Buddhists. Buddhists are very different. We have so many different traditions. We have so many different, levels of education. We have so many different languages. We have so many, different Buddhist histories. So if I speak, I'm speaking from my own perspective. But so far, Buddhist communities around the world have been quite welcoming of LGBTQ folk. And in fact, the first lesbian wedding in Taiwan was held not too long ago by a Buddhist. It was officiated by a Buddhist nun, Venerable Chao Hui, and it was in the news. And not everyone was pleased, but most people were quite pleased. And now I think everyone accepts this and is happy. So their parents are happy and they're happy. So that's a good thing. But I think let's hold this question and let's see how it evolves. It's up to us, isn't it? How welcoming we are and whether we nurture people of different gender identities. And if so, if they feel comfortable and then they want to be ordained, then we can help them find a path.
We have a question from Danny. I have recently taken my Bodhisattva vows. While meditating next to MABA's statue of Guan Yin, I was thinking about how genderless they seem. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes. As I say, over the centuries, even in India, we see that Avalokiteshvara begins to look more and more androgynous, neither male nor female, sometimes more feminine, in fact. But of course, Avalokiteshvara in India had many forms. There was the two-armed form, the four-armed form, the thousand-armed form. And then in China, by the 12th century, we see a new form, which is the Kuan Yin form, which is distinctively feminine in aspect. So I think her story actually, and there is a story of the Dragon King's daughter, where someone challenged her to become awakened in male form, and she said, no, I think gender is irrelevant. And she magically transformed herself into the body of a man and then changed herself back into the body of a woman. So she was illustrating through her supernormal powers the fluidity of gender. That nothing is fixed. Our identities are not fixed, right? We're a bunch of components, and all of those components are impermanent, including gender identity. In the big picture, we can see that from lifetime to lifetime, we take a different gender. In one lifetime, we're male. In one lifetime, we're female. It can go either way. Maybe we'll also be in between. In Hawaiian, we say mahu, means in between. So, yeah, I think it's a good question because it makes us question, what is gender actually? Okay, we know what sex is. There's certain, vital components that can be identified, but 3% of babies are born with indeterminate genitalia. And until recently, the medical staff in the hospital would arbitrarily assign a gender to that child. I know this because a professor in my department at University of Hawaii was a leader in pointing out that this is an ethical issue, the arbitrary assignment of gender. What happens to a child when they grow up and don't feel comfortable in that gender? You see the problem. And so he and his colleague pointed this out, and now it's a topic for widespread discussion. Questioning, what is gender? Sometimes it's good to reflect on it as a meditation. Yeah.
Charles asks, traditionally Buddhist nuns take many more vows than monks. Do you see any movement to balance the number of monastic vows between nuns and monks?
There's a history to this. The history is that the Bhikkhu Sangha was established first. Excuse me. Then 5 or 6 years after the Bhikkhu Sangha was established, Mahaprajapati wanted to join, right? So what happened was that the nuns more or less inherited the monks that had the precepts that had been established for the bhikkhus. 200 plus precepts. The numbers are different in the different Vinaya lineages. Originally, there were 18 different Vinaya lineages of monastic discipline. Today, there are only 3 that are still around, still extant. So when the nuns joined, well, let's back up a bit. Those precepts, were established due to different mistakes that the monks made. The Buddha didn't sit down one day and just decide to write out 200 precepts. No, they grew organically from the misbehavior of the monks. And the first one was the precept on sexual misconduct, right? Or sexual conduct at all. So the story is, if we have time, we have time. that one of the monks went home to visit his parents, and his parents, wishing for a grandchild, locked him in a room with his former wife. Aha. Well, as you can imagine, the inevitable happened, and the next morning, the other monks, when he walked out, the mother monk said, "What are you doing? You're not allowed to sleep with a woman. You're a monk." I said, "Oh, really?" And so they took the matter to the Buddha. This is how the precepts were established. They took the matter to the Buddha, and the Buddha called the offender, and he said, "Is it true or not true?" And the offender always confesses, "Oh, yes, noble sir, it is true." Then the Buddha said, "It is not appropriate, it is not correct. Henceforth, no bhikkhu should sleep with a woman." Okay. And then next, a monk went and slept with a man, and the same thing happened. They brought the matter to the Buddha. The Buddha called the offender. He said, "Is it true?" The offender said, "Yes." And then he said, "Okay, this is not appropriate. This is not correct. Henceforth, bhikkhus should not sleep with a man." So this is how the precepts evolved over time. Then when the nuns joined the Sangha, some additional precepts were created. There was one nun who was extremely intelligent and also, I think, a little bit naughty. And a bunch of precepts were created around Tulananda. And so in this way, the nuns had both the precepts of the monks, the bhikkhus, that they inherited, plus an additional 70-something precepts. So that they wound up with 300 plus precepts. Many of these precepts are to protect the nuns from sexual assault. And then there's some others also. Getting back to the earlier question, really this precept about not sleeping with a man is just about the only precedent that we have, the only information we have about same-sex activities in the Vinaya. And so, but there's one precept among the nuns' vows that might be suggestive of same-sex activity. It says 2 nuns should not share a quilt. So it sort of implies that something's going on under the quilt. So, but this is about all the information we have on this subject in the Buddhist texts. So in any case, in making decisions, we look to these texts and to try to get some feeling for what the Buddha might have thought about contemporary questions, for example. So in any case, that's how the bhikkhunis wound up with more precepts than the bhikkhus. It's not because they're more non-virtuous, as some people say. You hear often in some communities, "Oh, nuns must have twice as many delusions because they have twice as many precepts." But in fact, it's not twice as many. And also, if we took that logic, we would see that the majority of the precepts were created on the basis of a monk's misconduct, and only a minority were created on the basis of a nun's misconduct. So if we were to use that logic, we'd have to say that monks have twice as many delusions as nuns, or men have twice as many delusions as women. But actually, the logic doesn't hold, because it's causes and conditions over time. So that's sort of the historical background. Okay, the next question. Do parents resist more their daughters choosing to choose the path to become bhikkhunis than for their sons to become bhikkhus? Well, yes, I would say from my experience, the parents generally would encourage, at least in Tibetan society, not so much in Chinese society. I think sometimes Confucian traditions about having an heir are very strong in Chinese cultures, as I understand it. But in Tibetan society and in Southeast Asia, it's considered really, really wonderful if your son becomes a monk. And the parents are likely to, and until recently, until you know, capitalism became so strong in these countries, the parents would often encourage the the boys to become monks, and not so much the girls. The status of monks was very high. They were sure to get plenty of support. It was a career with a future. Whereas for the girls, there were very few monasteries to go to. There was very little support. There still is much less support for nuns than for monks. And the prestige of nuns is quite low, is definitely lower than monks. So and also the parents wanted the girls at home to help in the home, free labor, right? So they weren't likely to encourage the girls to become nuns, not at all, not at all. So we know many cases, not just in Tibetan societies, but also in Vietnam. I took my students to a Vietnamese temple on Sunday, and the nun told the story of how she wanted to be a nun since she was 10, but her parents wouldn't agree. And she insisted for 5 years, and finally they let her go. So it's not easy for women. Okay, so the major difficulties, the obstacles in Jamyang Foundation faces in promoting education for females in developing countries is mostly financial support. Creating viable communities where there's enough to eat, because if there's nothing to eat, the parents won't allow the girls to go. But if there's a good education provided in the monastery and there's plenty to eat, then they're much more likely to allow the girls to become nuns. The problem is that it's very difficult for nuns to get teachers. And this is the problem we've faced since the 1980s. All of the teachers were male, and very few were willing to teach nuns. On one hand, you can sort of understand it, because in a society where in those days there was no television, so, a monk going to a nunnery, it was likely to set off some gossip. What's the monk doing in the nunnery anyway? And so that could have been part of it. There was also at that time, at least in Himalayan societies, a preconception that women were stupid and couldn't learn and weren't interested in philosophy and only had the capacity to recite mantras. And then the nuns internalized this. When I first started a literacy program in Dharamsala in 1987, it took me a while to talk the nuns into it. I said, we can get a teacher and you can learn to read. And they said, oh, no, I'm much too stupid. I'll never learn to read. You Western nuns, you go and learn to read. I'll just say, Om Mani Padme Hum. And so they have been hearing this since they were children, that women are intellectually deficient, and that anyway, practice is the most important thing. So you don't need to study, you don't need to learn to read, you can just recite Om Mani Padme Hum. And they do very well at that, and they keep a very pure heart and so forth. But now, finally, the way I talked them into learning to read was, if you learn to read, you'll be able to understand the Dalai Lama's teachings. And they went, oh, some light bulb went on in their head. And they went, oh, okay. And then they all wanted to learn to read. So we got a Lama to teach them the alphabet. And within 2 months, all of them could read. Ages 36 to 73, they could all read. So this is a great success story. And that's how we began, actually, because then the nuns wanted to learn grammar, and then they wanted to learn philosophy, and then they wanted to learn English. And before we knew it, we had a full-time study program. And then, Jamyang, our facilities became too small, and we had to get some land to build more rooms. and looking for that land. I got bitten by a snake and almost died. And, many obstacles on the way. Yeah, this arm is a reconstructed arm. But in the end, now there are 150 nuns at the monastery, at that one monastery. And that's where 6 of the first group of geshes emerged. So that was a real success story too. So now the hope is that now that the nuns are emerging as teachers of Dharma, then they will be able to spread out to other monasteries and serve as teachers in different monasteries. And then the nuns will no longer be reliant on or dependent on male teachers, right? So, yes, it said that the next question is about disrobing. It's true that in the Buddhist traditions, men are allowed to disrobe and re-enter the Sangha up to 7 times, but nuns are not. I can't say for certain how this came about. My first guess would be that it has something to do with the possibility that they become pregnant outside the monastery. And then if they were allowed to re-enter and were pregnant and gave birth, then people might assume that the nun got pregnant while she was in the monastery, and that would bring disrepute to not only to the monastery but to nuns in general. That seems the most likely explanation, but because remember, they didn't have any sort of artificial birth control in those states. There's no way to control pregnancy. So that is probably the most likely explanation, but I can't be certain. Yeah. So it looks discriminatory, and it could just be sexism. What to say? But it could be a practical matter also. There is something though. There's one other possibility. There's this sense that somehow sex is defiling, and that if you were to leave the monastery and engage in sexual activities, you would somehow become defiled. But then that logic should hold for men as well as for women, shouldn't it? So I really don't know what the explanation is. I only know that, like, for example, in Burma, the idea of the virgin nun, it's considered far preferable for a nun to be ordained as a virgin before they've had, been married or had any kind of sexual conduct. There is such a preconception, yeah, something to do with purity, and pollution taboos and this sort of thing. So, oh, you have very good questions. I'm really impressed with the thoughtfulness of your questions. Very good, very good.
Don says that could change now because we have pregnancy tests. So perhaps that could change.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Right, for sure. Good idea.
Thank you for your teaching. Do we have time for you to lead the dedication of merit for us, please?
Me too. Okay, so let's sit calmly, comfortably, straight spine, and completely relaxed. Take 3 deep, relaxing breaths. Next, we rejoice in the merit that we have accumulated through listening to the Dharma, contemplating the Dharma, and putting the Dharma into practice. Feel great joy in our hearts. And then we share this merit with all sentient beings throughout space and time. Lama Sangye Dukyuni Doa Chikyam Mahapa Keiki Sala Gupa By virtue of the merit that we have accumulated, may we achieve the state of perfect awakening in order to liberate all living beings from suffering, leaving not one behind. Thank you.